today for the second annual Wallace Stegner Center Young Scholar Lecture. I'm Bob Kiter. I direct the Wallace Stegner Center for Land Resources and the Environment here at the University of Utah S.J. Quinney College of Law. And I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to introduce our speaker today. I'd first like to acknowledge the tremendous assistance and work that both Jan Nystrom, who is standing back here at the back door, and Jenny Wehrstall, who is out of the room at the moment, have done in organizing and bringing this program to fruition today. And let me welcome all of you here too. I also would like to acknowledge the financial support of the Cultural Vision Fund in making the Stegner Center Young Scholar Program available to us. It is something that we envisioned for some time and are very pleased now to be moving forward with this program. As our second young scholar at the Wallace Stegner Center, I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Amy Sinden from Temple University Beasley School of Law, where her environmental writings that have been published in a number of different law journals have attracted widespread attention, both for their thoughtfulness and their provocativeness, and I think we will see some of that today in the topic of her lecture. Before Professor Sinden entered the Academy, she had a number of other important appointments that provide a sense of the depth of her background, and they included clerking for the Federal District Court in the state of New Jersey, clerking for the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, also in the central northeast area of the country. She did this after graduating summa cum laude from the University of Pennsylvania Law School in 1991. She followed up this early clerkship career with stints in no particular order here at the Community Legal Services Program in Philadelphia, as an attorney with Earth Justice Legal Defense Fund in Seattle, Washington, and also working in the environmental legal field with Citizens for Pennsylvania's Future. Her writings focus on environmental law. She also teaches in the area of property and civil procedure, and her research focuses, at least in part, on the cost-benefit analysis in environmental standard setting. However, her topic today, which we're very pleased to have her here addressing, is the question of, is there a human right to security from climate change? Certainly a very topical subject in everyone's mind, as witnessed by your presence. We apologize for the smallness of the room. We will plan better in the future, but I'm sure the lecture will be more than worth it. Please join me in welcoming Amy Sinden.
Thanks so much, Bob. And I just want to thank the Stegner Center for having me out here to your beautiful city. I've been running up in the foothills each morning, huffing and puffing a little bit because I come from sea level, but just enjoying the beauty of this place. And thanks to Jan and Jenny and to Bob and Bob and the funders of the Stegner Center, who I understand are here, for putting on this great program. Well, let me get started. You can see I have here what may be a familiar graph to many of you, the Keeling curve that shows the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The scientific consensus is now clear that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases from the burning of fossil fuels and other human activities are accumulating in the atmosphere, and that as a result, average global temperatures are rising. We're already feeling the effects, right? 2005 was the hottest year on record. Of the 21 hottest years measured since they first started keeping records in 1860, 20 of them have occurred in the last 25 years. The permafrost is melting in the Arctic. Glaciers around the world are receding. By 2030, scientists are telling us there will no longer be any glaciers left in Glacier National Park. As the Earth heats, ecosystems around the globe are changing. Species that have evolved for millennia to adapt to particular climate conditions are finding their habitats so drastically altered that their very survival is threatened. As the Arctic sea ice melts, as many of you know, the polar bears, a species that couldn't be further from any center of human industrial activity, are now facing extinction. But that, of course, is just one species. Scientists are telling us now that by mid-century, human-induced climate change may well drive 25% of all species on Earth to extinction. And that's the moderate estimate. The high-end estimate is 50% of all species on Earth by mid-century. There's literally no longer any spot on Earth that is untouched by human action. In the words of Bill McKibben, we are witnessing the end of nature. If we continue our present course, the coming decades will bring increasing drought, increasingly severe storms, the spread of tropical diseases, massive human dislocation as low-lying coastal areas are inundated by rising seas. And because there's a significant lag time between when heat-trapping gases accumulate in the atmosphere and when the climate actually reaches a new equilibrium in response to that, we won't even feel the full effects of the greenhouse gases that we've already pumped into the atmosphere until maybe another century or more. So we've already done even more damage than we realize. Jim Hansen, NASA's top climate scientist, says we're nearing a tipping point, that if emissions of greenhouse gases continue at their current rate, within as little as a decade, we may reach a point of no return, a point at which feedback loops are triggered and avoiding what Hansen calls devastating circumstances becomes impossible. We will have essentially created a new planet, one that's an entirely different place from the place that humans and other species have evolved for millennia. In one sense, all of humanity is in this together. But in another sense, this crisis divides us, both in terms of culpability and in terms of vulnerability. The haves, as you can see from this chart, are responsible for the vast majority of greenhouse gases that have already accumulated in the atmosphere. But it's the have-nots that are likely to bear the brunt of climate change's worst effects. So, for example, you can see here that the U.S., with less than 5% of the world's population, is responsible for more than 28% of the greenhouse gases that have already accumulated in the atmosphere. Yet, despite the fact that it's the developed world that has, by and large, caused this problem, many of the areas that are most vulnerable to, for example, sea level rise, to devastating drought are in the developing world. And beyond that, throughout the world, it's the poor that are less likely to have the resources to cope with calamity when calamity strikes. And in fact, Katrina was sort of a grim preview of things to come. And that's not to say that Hurricane Katrina was necessarily caused or made more severe by global warming. It may very well have been, but we'll probably never know for sure. But the point is rather that as climate change triggers increasingly severe storms and rising seas over the coming decades, Katrina is the kind of thing that we're going to see more of around the globe. And the most disturbing lesson of Katrina was perhaps the fact that when disaster strikes and existing infrastructure is inadequate, it's those who lack power and resources that suffer the most. The statistics on sea level rise are particularly telling. In the past few years, as you may be aware, scientists have revised their predictions about sea level rise dramatically upward, as they've discovered new evidence about feedback loops that are melting the polar ice far faster than anyone imagined even 10 years ago. There's now significant concern that the ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica may collapse and slide into the sea, triggering dramatic sea level rise of as much as 25 meters throughout the globe. Here's a map that shows various areas around the globe and the extent to which land would be flooded by various levels of sea level rise. So you can see the dark blue is what would be inundated by just 6 meters of sea level rise. The light blue is what would be inundated by 25 meters of sea level rise. And if you compare this map to a map of population density, it's rather telling, because you can see that much of the world's population is concentrated in low-lying coastal areas. And worse than that, much of the world's poorest populations are concentrated in low-lying areas. So, for example, if you look here at Bangladesh, if you look here at India, and if you look at China over there, you can see lots of population concentrated in low-lying areas. Here's a chart that shows us the population of people that would be displaced by various degrees of sea level rise. You can see there 23 million, at 6 meters of sea level rise, you've got 23 million people in Indonesia, 24 million people in Bangladesh, 46 million people in India, and 93 million people in China and Taiwan. And of course, at 25 meters, the story is far, far worse. But as you look at these population numbers, people that would be displaced by sea level rise, for comparison, think about the fact that Hurricane Katrina displaced just 2 million people. And that was in the richest country in the world. So we're conducting this grand experiment on the only Earth we have that, if unchecked, is likely to dramatically and irreversibly alter the planet, changing ecosystems that we and other species have adapted to for millennia. Global warming may well be the most profound moral issue to ever face the human species. At a minimum, I'd like to suggest that at least it's likely to be the defining moral issue of the 21st century. Just as the Holocaust, racial segregation in the US, apartheid in South Africa, and a host of other struggles made oppression of stigmatized groups the defining moral issue of the 20th century. And profound moral issues, it seems to me, demand a profound response from law. And as we enter the 21st century, human rights, at least at the rhetorical level, it seems to me, is the law's best response to profound, unthinkable, far-reaching moral transgression. And more fundamentally, it's the law's best response and the law's strongest condemnation of the exploitation of the weak by the powerful. Human rights was the law's response to the moral crisis of the 20th century, and I want to suggest that it's also the appropriate legal response to the moral crisis of the 21st century. Now, this is not just some harebrained scheme from the ivory tower, there are actually 2 lawsuits that have already been filed around the world that allege human rights violations in connection with climate change. One was filed by the Inuit people in the Arctic in the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights, and it's against the United States government, alleging that the acts and omissions of the United States government with respect to climate change have violated the Inuits' human rights. That was filed just about a year ago. Also, just about a year ago, communities in Africa's Niger Delta won an injunction from a trial court in Nigeria in an action that they filed against the Shell Oil Company and the Nigerian National Petroleum Company, challenging this incredibly wasteful practice of gas flaring. So Shell and the Nigerian National Petroleum Company are drilling for oil all over the Niger Delta, one of those low-lying areas vulnerable to sea level rise, by the way, that we saw on the previous slide. And when they do that, and when they come upon natural gas that coexists with the oil under the ground, rather than capturing the natural gas and selling it, they do what you see in this slide, they burn it off. And you can imagine that in addition to the sort of run-of-the-mill environmental problems that that causes for the people living there, it's having an enormous impact on climate change. It's emitting into the atmosphere huge amounts of greenhouse gases. And so in their lawsuit in the Nigerian trial court, these communities in the Niger Delta alleged that this practice of gas flaring is violating their constitutional and human rights. Okay, so, well, the question is, do these kinds of lawsuits make any sense? Can our human rights tradition really justify a right to security from climate change? I want to argue that it can, and I want to argue that that justification for such a right can actually be found in what may seem an unlikely place, and that is rather than looking in the sort of more modern and maybe seemingly more flexible human rights of the 20th century, what we call economic and social rights, and what some are now calling third-generation human rights. I want to suggest that this human right to security from climate change can actually be grounded in those good old-fashioned Enlightenment-era civil and political rights of the kind that form the basis for our Bill of Rights here under the U.S. Constitution. So I think I have 2 tasks. The first is to explain to you what I think human rights are fundamentally and what are the functions that they serve in society. And I'm hoping to convince you that the fundamental function of human rights, of civil and political human rights, is to combat power imbalances in society. And so when I'm done with that, my second task is then to try to convince you that climate change has something to do with power imbalance. So first of all, when I talk about human rights, I'm sort of lumping together international human rights and domestic constitutional rights. And that's because those are the kind of rights that stand outside of and above the state. They're the kind of rights that come into play when for some reason we can't trust the state to police itself, when we're particularly worried about some abuse of government power. And you can contrast those kinds of rights with the sort of ordinary run-of-the-mill rights of tort and contract, which are the kind of rights that governments enable private citizens to enforce against each other. So what's the function that civil and political human rights serve? They're often described as and justified as protecting human autonomy and dignity. And there may be some truth to that, but it seems to me that ultimately that's not a very satisfying definition, because it doesn't distinguish for us human rights from these ordinary run-of-the-mill rights of tort and contract. You know, my autonomy gets invaded anytime anybody hits me over the head with a club, right? But if Bob hits me over the head with a club, we call that a tort. It's when the guy with the uniform on and the power and the authority of the state behind him hits me over the head with a club that we call it a human rights violation. and so I think in order to define and understand human rights, we have to look at them relationally, not just at the person whose human rights are being violated, but also at the person who's doing the violating. What makes a human rights violation, what evokes the sort of sense of outrage that makes us want to give it that kind of special treatment, is that these are David and Goliath stories. They're stories about the weak being exploited by the powerful. Now, during the Enlightenment, when civil and political rights were born, the largest aggregation of power in society was the state. And so our civil and political rights tradition aims primarily at counteracting the disparity in power between the state and the individual. So, for example, many of the central rights in our civil and political rights tradition aim at leveling the playing field between the state and the accused in a criminal prosecution. The free speech right is also often justified in terms of allowing public criticism of government officials and therefore providing a crucial check on government power. And civil and political rights, our civil and political rights tradition is not limited to this power imbalance between the state and the individual. The Equal Protection Guarantee, of course, was added to the U.S. Bill of Rights right after the Civil War in response to what is probably the most extreme form of power imbalance between private groups in society, slavery. Right? And of course, since then, the Equal Protection Guarantee has been interpreted to address the subordination of other groups as well. Now, if I had a little more time, I would at this point talk to you about a number of the most prominent rights theorists of recent decades and the extent to which they have also analyzed human rights in this way as correctives for distortions in government decision-making caused by power imbalance. John Hart Ely and Ronald Dworkin, among others, have looked at rights in this way. The civic Republicans have also long viewed rights as protecting the democratic process from the distorting effects of power. What the Founding Fathers called the problem of faction. More recently, Cass Sunstein has said that much of modern constitutional doctrine reflects a single perception of the underlying evil, the distribution of resources or opportunities to one group rather than another solely because those benefited have exercised the raw power to obtain government assistance. And so civil and political rights aim fundamentally to counteract that underlying evil of power imbalance in society. Okay, so what does all this have to do with global warming? What's the underlying evil of global warming that's driving humanity to pursue activities that may well lead to seriously damaging, if not catastrophic consequences? Well, the economic worldview that increasingly dominates our public policy discourse has a sort of neat and tidy answer to that question. And that is the tragedy of the commons, right? In his famous 1968 essay, Garrett Hardin told the story of a group of cattle herders, all of whom grazed their cattle on a commonly held pasture. And the problem, of course, is that each time a cattle herder decides to add another cow to her herd, she reaps the full benefit of being able to sell the extra milk or the extra meat at the market, but bears only a fraction of the cost that that cow imposes on the commons. And so because there's this mismatch between sort of social costs and benefits and individual costs and benefits, incentives are skewed, and each cattle herder, Hardin tells us, will continue to add cows to her herd well beyond the point where the carrying capacity of the commons is exceeded. And Hardin, of course, pointed out that many pollution problems can be conceptualized in this way. In the context of global warming, of course, we can think of the global atmosphere as the commons, and we can describe the skewed incentives that drive each individual to keep pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, or the incentives that drive each country to avoid regulating such behavior. as an example of the same phenomenon. And Hardin's parable, of course, is insightful, and it certainly goes part way to explaining why we've been unable to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, despite decades of compelling evidence about the dangers of climate change. But one problem with economic theory is that in its single-minded focus on maximizing overall social welfare, it ignores the distribution of wealth and power in society. And so the cattle herders, for example, in Garrett Hardin's story, are described in generic terms. We sort of assume that they're identical in terms of wealth and power and status. And so when Hardin tells us that the solution to the tragedy of the commons is collective agreement, what he calls mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon, we imagine the cattle herders getting together in some sort of idyllic New England town meeting and coming up with an agreement to put limits on grazing. But what if a few cattle herders are big corporate conglomerates that are running enormous factory farms that are adding 100 new cows to their herd every month? And they know that these practices are eventually going to destroy the commons. But in the meantime, the profits that they can make are so huge they don't care. And by the way, who's selling all of these cows to these cattle herders? Certainly the cow suppliers stand to lose a lot in short-term profits if grazing limits are imposed. Imagine that the cattle suppliers and these big corporate factory farms get together and start visiting the other cattle herders one-on-one and offering them large sums of money to vote against grazing limits. And then imagine that they hire a PR firm to run an ad campaign to portray the evidence that overgrazing is destroying the commons as junk science. And they start funding think tanks with names like People for a Healthy Commons that employ experts who publish articles and white papers and appear on TV talk shows arguing that the overgrazing problem is just a hoax perpetrated by the liberal media. The point is that unless we take into account the distribution of power and resources in society, we're only going to see part of the story. And in the context of climate change, there is an enormous power imbalance between the interests that stand to gain from climate change regulation and the interests that stand in the short term, anyway, to lose. Those who stand to lose are relatively small in number. Many of them are corporations with substantial wealth and influence. Each one stands to suffer substantial, concrete economic loss in the short run if climate change regulation is enacted. And this is exactly the kind of group that has a relatively easy time organizing into a political pressure group. On the other side, those who stand to gain from climate change regulation are all of us. And we are large in number. We have interests that, while real, are harder to measure in economic terms. Many of them are not likely to be felt until far into the future. And this is just the kind of group that has a particularly hard time organizing into a political pressure group. This imbalance of power helps explain, for example, why the U.S. Senate was unwilling to ratify the Kyoto Treaty, even though at the time a large majority of the American public supported the treaty. A New York Times poll taken right before the accord was entered into found that 65% of Americans thought the U.S. should take steps now to cut emissions of greenhouse gases, quote, regardless of what other countries do. But just 4 months before that, the Senate had passed by a 95-0 margin the Byrd-Hagel resolution, which essentially said the opposite. It said that the U.S. should not sign Kyoto unless it mandated reductions by developing countries too, and of course since the treaty did not mandate immediate reductions by developing countries, this Byrd-Hagel resolution spelled the death knell for any attempt to ratify the Kyoto Treaty. The only explanation for this disconnect between what the American people wanted and what their senators voted for is the overwhelming power and influence of the corporate interests that stand to lose from climate change regulation. In addition to direct lobbying, industry also distorted the political decision-making process by skewing the public debate. Since the late 1980s, oil and coal and car manufacturers and other industrial interests have been setting up a series of front groups with the mission of creating public doubt about the science behind global warming. The Global Climate Coalition is probably the best known of these. It was formed in 1989 by Exxon, General Motors, Ford, Shell, Texaco, Chevron, Chrysler, Amoco, the American Forest and Paper Association, and dozens of other big corporations and industry groups. And one of the first things that they did is to hire a PR firm called the E. Bruce Harrison Company, whose previous successes included working on behalf of the pesticide industry in the early 1960s to discredit Rachel Carson and her book Silent Spring. Over the next decade, the Global Climate Coalition spent millions of dollars on a campaign that included heavy funding of scientists willing to express skepticism about the science behind global warming, and efforts to publicly smear and discredit scientists on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That group disbanded in 2002, but there are plenty of others. The Advancement of Sound Science Coalition, for example, was created in 1993 by Philip Morris Corporation. By a PR firm that was hired by Philip Morris, specifically in order to discredit an EPA report that had just come out about the dangers of passive smoke. But to make this group look like a grassroots movement rather than the front for Philip Morris than it was, the PR firm recommended that the group address other issues as well, including global warming, and it has since become one of the major voices in the attempt to discredit climate change science, and it has also since received substantial funding from Exxon and others. Just in 2005, Exxon donated $6.8 million to various groups and think tanks like the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which ran a TV ad last spring timed to coincide with the release of Al Gore's movie that argued that carbon dioxide is actually good for the environment. Now, often climate change gets cast as a failure of individual will. If we could all just use energy-efficient light bulbs and stop driving SUVs, everything would be fine, right? And it seems to me that this is a misleading formulation because it obscures the power dynamic that's really driving humanity's response to climate change. Like so much of our public discourse recently, this perspective looks through the myopic lens of economics and ignores politics and power. More fundamentally, it suffers from two fundamental misconceptions that underlie the economic worldview. The first is that this individual will perspective fails to recognize that individual market preferences are significantly shaped and constrained by corporate power. Now, you may or may not agree with me that corporate advertising and the corporate-backed entertainment industry play a major role in shaping preferences, that if ads and movies and TV shows portrayed Priuses as being as cool as SUVs, we'd have a lot more Priuses on the road and a lot fewer SUVs. But if you've seen the movie Who Killed the Electric Car, which documents General Motors' deliberate decision to take the electric car off the market despite overwhelming consumer demand, then I think you have to agree with me that at least that the preferences of individual consumers as expressed in the market are at least constrained by corporate power. The second problem with the individual will perspective is that it fails to recognize that individuals can hold political preferences that differ markedly from their market preferences. From an economic perspective, of course, climate change represents a failure of individual will. That's because it results from the tragedy of the commons, and it's each individual's market preference to take no action to prevent climate change. But Hardin told us 4 decades ago that there's a solution to the tragedy of the commons, and that's collective action. And the reason that such collective action is possible is because individuals can hold political preferences that are radically different from their market preferences. So even though I may be unwilling to go to the trouble of installing energy-efficient light bulbs on my own, if I can't be sure that everyone else will do this, or enough people will do the same to make a difference, I may very well be in favor of legislation that requires everyone to install energy-efficient light bulbs. And that's exactly the attitude, by the way, of the American people with respect to climate change. For at least a decade, a solid majority of the American public has been in favor of regulatory measures to curb greenhouse gases, even if it requires financial sacrifice. A poll last spring showed 87% of Americans in favor of government measures to control greenhouse gases, and 59% of Americans are even willing to go along with a gas tax if the result would be less global warming. A 2003 poll showed more than 80% of Americans in favor of higher mileage standards for cars as a way of curbing global warming, and 69% support such standards even if it means paying more for a car. So it seems to me that the reason the collective action that Garrett Hardin prescribed hasn't happened is because we're facing a political failure as well as a market failure. In a well-functioning democracy, the political solution to the tragedy of the commons would not be hard to achieve. But in the United States, the political solution has been derailed by the vast disparity in power between the wealthy and powerful corporate interests that stand to lose from climate change regulation and the diffuse and disorganized public interests that stand to gain. It's the solution to that failure, the political failure, that we need to focus on, because once we fix the political failure, the market failure will fall into place. And it seems to me that the only legal mechanism that's ever had the moral and rhetorical force to stand up to that kind of power is human rights. Now, obviously, the enormity and the urgency of the climate change problem means we can't rely on any single strategy. We have to pursue every strategy we can think of to try to stop climate change as quickly as possible. And yesterday's events may even mean that strategies that we couldn't even imagine a day or two ago are now opening up. But it seems to me that talking about climate change is a human rights issue. And filing lawsuits that challenge government and industry's business-as-usual approach to climate change as a human rights violation is the best way I can think of to shift the conversation from sterile, abstract prognostications about economic efficiency to a conversation about morality, about right and wrong, and about the abuse of power. Thank you. Are there any questions?
You know, the Clean Air Act, I think there was one in 1967 or 1970, based on human rights, was essentially gutted by cost-benefit analysis under Reagan's executive order. You see that happening again? I mean, this is...
That's a very interesting question in light of the cost-benefit analysis that just came down from the British government last week, right? I mean, so we got Tony Blair in the international media last week announcing that an economic analysis of climate change had been done and that it shows that we need to take immediate action. So yeah, I mean, sometimes cost-benefit analysis can, and the sort of economic perspective, can also push us in what I view as the right direction for trying to do something about climate change. Although I could talk about cost-benefit analysis for a long time. I mean, my view is that cost-benefit analysis and the economic perspective is not the right way to approach those things, because ultimately it's so indeterminate and so manipulable. I mean, I'm sure that Exxon and everybody else can probably find an economist to redo that study and have it come out in the opposite way. And that's one of the worries about the sort of economic approach. But the other worry is that it's just not taking into account political dynamics, power dynamics, distributions of resources in society.
Simply allowed the big corporations to trade toxic pollution units.
Well, I mean, there's really two separate things. The executive order, I mean, the good news from my perspective, being sort of opposed to cost-benefit analysis, is that the executive order you're talking about that Reagan put into place in 1980 was just that, an executive order. And as such, it didn't actually have the power to override statutory provisions like the Clean Air Act. So that to the extent that the Clean Air Act still says, in a lot of instances, you have to reduce pollution levels as much as is technologically and economically feasible, for example, that's still the standard that controls. Now, a cost-benefit analysis may still have to get done, and that may affect the public debate in some way, but the standard under the Clean Air Act is still often a feasibility standard, a technology-based standard, sometimes a purely health-based standard.
So what would the mechanism for the enforcement of human rights under this?
Uh-oh.
Would the plaintiffs
Yeah, I knew there'd be a practical question. Don't you know that's why I'm in academia? Well, there's lots of possibilities, and the two lawsuits that I made reference to both involve groups of people that are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Now, the Inuit in the Arctic are probably the best example, because as you probably know, effects of climate change are happening far more quickly in the Arctic than in other parts of the world, or at both poles, right? The temperature increases are sort of twice what they are on the rest of the globe. And so they are seeing all sorts of problems, including melting permafrost, melting sea ice that's drastically altering their way of life. Their homes are collapsing. They're not able to use the traditional hunting routes that they've always used that involve walking out over the ice in the winter, et cetera, et cetera. So the plaintiffs would be, in some sense, could be anyone, but probably more convincingly can be particular groups that are particularly vulnerable. Again, those in Nigeria are particularly vulnerable because they're living in a particularly low-lying area. Well, in both of those cases, they are relying on specific existing human rights, right? Like, for example, the right to life, which is a sort of a nice broad one that can encompass all sorts of things. They're also relying on some of the more recent economic and social rights and third-generation rights I made reference to. There are, in some contexts, actual rights to a clean environment in some international human rights documents, rights to control over natural resources. Those are also being used. So what I'm arguing for is a little bit different from what the plaintiffs in those cases were actually doing, in the sense that they were trying to fit into sort of specific human rights that already exist out there in particular documents, right? That say you have a right to life. And I'm almost trying to say we should evolve a brand new human right that is specifically about environmental harms, or maybe specifically about climate change. Because in my view, virtually all environmental disputes, and climate change is a great example, involve this kind of acute imbalance of power, which is fundamentally what human rights are trying to get at. So can somebody go out tomorrow and successfully use my theory to get an injunction? Probably not. But on the other hand, it seems to me that one of the most important things that human rights can do is to serve a rhetorical function. For example, I think you can argue that a lot of the value of the Brown versus Board of Education decision in the 1950s in this country was not so much the actual desegregation of the schools, because in fact we have a lot of schools that remain segregated, but that nonetheless it had an enormous rhetorical influence on our society and on the way that race is viewed in our society.
What would your opinion be on redressability? I mean, if Jim Hanson's correct, we don't have enough time for what you're proposing to even work. So, on a practical level, what's the objective here?
Well, again, I mean, the objective is to start talking about this, to not only have the kind of economic analysis that came out of Britain last week, but to also have people talking about climate change in human rights terms, because that starts to shift the conversation away from economic efficiency and to morality. And you know, when Al Gore stands up in that movie and says, this is a moral issue, I think that's very important. And I think this is another way, within the context of law, to try to shift the conversation in that way. But absolutely right, we're running out of time, and that's right. I think we still have some time to make a big difference, but certainly there's huge urgency.
You're talking about a disparity between those who cause global warming and those who suffer under it. But is there not also now, if we are just looking at the process of trying to prevent global warming, a disparity that those who care about the environment are, so to say, the fools who can be exploited by those who have a more sharp pencil and can pounce on them. Like I've heard that nowhere in the building industry you get more skimming, and then if you try to build a energy efficient building, because they know there's someone who has some extra money and get that money out of their pocket. Or people care about something, and other people they expend energy for a goal, and then other people try to channel that energy into their own pockets.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that a lot of what you're talking about is the problem of skewed incentives, you know, that in some sense can be expressed as a version of the tragedy of the commons, right? And the solution to that has to be government regulation, right? That once you regulate and you provide incentives for builders, let's say, to build energy efficient and green buildings, then they're going to do it, right? And the same builders who may be doing what you say may very well have a political preference for building green buildings if the whole system was shifted so that they would actually be given incentives to do that. Right?
Pushing a little bit here, because I read an article like in last month's Business Week or last week's or whatever. They're talking about a lot of new lawsuits coming out along the same lines as the cigarette lawsuits. I don't know if you've heard about this or seen it. And it's particularly a prominent Texas law firm, Godfrey and Sussman, who used to represent the cigarette companies, are now representing Texas cities. Is that a different approach that they're taking? Because I'm not sure what approach they're taking.
Well, there's a lot of lawsuits that are being brought based on a nuisance theory and other kinds of tort theories, right? And so in a sense, yeah. I mean, to the extent that I was sort of breaking down legal theories and rights theories into human rights on the one hand and then sort of private rights of tort and contract on the other hand, that would fit into that context. And arguably, that kind of lawsuit, well, I mean, again, all of the same questions that were raised about my idea, I mean, come up in those lawsuits as well. I mean, when the New York Attorney General brought the first nuisance case against the coal-fired power plants in the Midwest, there was a lot of naysaying about, you know, this is never going to succeed, and it has been dismissed so far. Unclear what's going to happen on appeal. But there may be value to bringing these kinds of lawsuits, whether it's a tort lawsuit or a human rights lawsuit, even if it doesn't result in an actual injunction or an actual remedy from a court, just in terms of sort of shifting public opinion. Right?
I wasn't sure which category of rights you were referring to. At the beginning, you talked
Well,
What are your rights you're focusing on?
but I guess what I'm trying to say is I believe that you can ground a right to a clean environment in our civil and political rights tradition, which is different from using the kinds of rights to a clean environment that sort of exist out there in the economic and social rights realm, right? And you could say, well, why bother, right? Why split hairs between those sort of two different human rights traditions? But I guess my thought is that civil and political rights, especially in this country, I think it's different abroad, but especially in this country, it's civil and political rights that enjoy the most respect, that people really take seriously, that people think are something real worth paying attention to. And that's why I'd like to be able to ground this kind of environmental right in that tradition.
I'm just wondering whether you perceive any problems with using human rights. In other words, you see it as a strength. I'm just wondering whether there might be some weaknesses in trying to use human rights as a way of bringing to bear some sort of set of moral concerns upon all the issues. Because sometimes what one finds is that human rights is subject to all sorts of constraints. So, for example, even the attempt to characterize the right to the environment as a civil and political right might be subject to various constraints, just as we could characterize something like peace as a civil and political right. And so there are also constraints about enforceability, about whether we can get to private actors if we focus on human rights. Because as you say, human rights is just about the relationship between the state and the individual.
Right.
Whereas in your presentation, as you very rightly pointed out, private actors have a huge role to play in all these issues. So human rights may not touch those private actors, at least in terms of classical civil and political rights.
Yeah, and I have another whole paper arguing that that human rights, these same civil and political rights, ought to be enforceable directly against multinational corporations. And in a nutshell, the argument is essentially, when civil and political rights were born in the Enlightenment, as I said, states were the biggest aggregation of power in society. Now we're facing a very different society in which, as everyone knows, many multinational corporations are bigger and more powerful than many states. And so obviously it's a little more complicated than that, but the idea being that if you really take seriously the notion that rights are fundamentally, that these kinds of rights, civil and political rights, are fundamentally a response to power imbalance, then you ought to be able to assert them directly against corporations, at least particularly powerful corporations, and there's clearly a line drawing problem there. But that you ought to be able to assert them directly against corporations as well. Certainly the Nigeria case, which involves a claim against Shell, is an example of that. Now, interestingly, that sort of state action problem wasn't even raised in that lawsuit, but that's sort of another question.
You're talking about rights, the sort of right to be free of the negative impact that global climate change will have on individuals. I wonder how you would respond to the argument that the United States and the Western world has achieved their standard of living through the burning of fossil fuels, and then in fact less developed countries have a right to that same kind of advancement in doing it the same way. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, the climate change issue creates these enormous divisions between the developed world and the developing world. My hope would be that if the developed world was leading on this issue in the way that I believe would be, if we didn't face the kind of political failure that we have faced as a result of this power imbalance in our society, that the developed world would be leading in terms of developing new technologies, right, that are better than the old technologies, that are better than burning coal and burning fossil fuels. In the same way, and that those technologies would then be the ones that the developing world would want to adopt. In the same way that throughout the developing world, you see now, cell phones have taken over before there were ever the old-fashioned hardwired phones. And so you'd like to see the same kind of jump to new technology. But I think the culpability lies with the developed world for not taking that leadership role.
We might expect to see coming from the collective will of Canadians with the recent
I don't know. And, you know, and obviously, it's not like I've had a chance to sort of study the politics of exactly what's going on in Canada and what explains that decision to withdraw from Kyoto. You can imagine what I would suspect is going on, but I don't know for sure. But I think it's sad to see Canada sort of following in the footsteps of the United States in that situation.
Trying to conceptualize the nature of the right to humanity. Is it an affirmative right to a clean environment which applies even-handedly across every person on the globe? Is it a right to be free from impacts which applies even-handedly across the globe? Or is it a right to be free from disproportionate impacts to address the power disparity that we talked about? Just like we distinguished between suspect classes for amendment purposes, and conceptualize it that way, does it become more meaningful for those who are disproportionately affected?
That's a really interesting question, and one that I haven't thought through as much as I need to. I tend to want the power imbalance that I'm wanting to ground this right in is the power imbalance that's distorting the political system, right, and preventing, let's say, the United States federal government from implementing the kind of regulation of greenhouse gases that needs to happen. And that's a political failure that arguably affects everyone on the globe. So I would tend to sort of choose your middle suggestion, that is to say, I think there needs to be some impact, probably. You need to be able to say that you are being injured in some way in order to assert a human rights claim. But I'm not sure that you need to be able to show that you are disproportionately impacted. In other words, that it has to be the people in the Arctic or the people in the low-lying Niger Delta that bring the claim, in the sense that the problem, the power imbalance, is that power imbalance between ExxonMobil and the public interest that is distorting the political process and is ultimately harming all of us. Right?
I'm more optimistic since the election results. I thought the 90s would be the decade of the environment as a newcomer to this country. I'm amazed how the ball's been dropped for so many years.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's hard to say at this point, but I mean, certainly the election, at least to some extent, changes the political landscape that we're looking at. I still haven't heard what's going on with the Senate.
There's
But,
given us a spring.
yeah. I think there's hope.
That is perhaps a good note to end this on. Thank you,
Thanks.
Amy, for joining us, and thank you all for joining us.